Thank you, Rob. It's amazing to be here. September 3rd was a date way in the future for a long, long time that maybe might come and the book might come out, and here we are. And I want to thank you for hosting this. I want to thank you all for coming. Often when I speak, I start by apologizing for the long introduction with my bio, and I say, you know, you could have dispensed with the long bio. The long bio on our website is really only intended for my mother, and she's not here. But she is here today, so thanks for reading the full bio. And there are a bunch of people who need thanks, and I'll get to you later, but I do want to say from the outset that it is fantastic. My parents are here, my wife is here, one of my boys is here, wearing his favorite tie. You look very good, Jojo. Thank you for coming. With Hezbollah fighting alongside the Assad regime in Syria, and with people wondering how and whether Hezbollah might be part of any retaliation if there is, in fact, a strike on Syria over the use of chemical weapons. With the EU's designation, finally, the designation of Hezbollah's military wing as a terrorist group within the European Union, there's plenty to talk about Hezbollah in the here and now, and we'll circle back to that in a few minutes. But for the sake of context, let's start at the beginning. And one reason I wrote this book is because of the lack of context that has been out there. There's so little publicly available in any credible fashion about the history of Hezbollah's covert activities, the history of its activities outside of Lebanon. If you looked at the literature review, and before I started into this I did, there's lots of good stuff on Hezbollah, some not so good too. But there's lots of good literature on Hezbollah, and almost all of it is about Hezbollah as a political actor in Lebanon, and it is a political actor in Lebanon. Or about Hezbollah as a social welfare provider in Lebanon, and it is a social welfare provider in Lebanon. Or about Hezbollah's militia activities in Lebanon, targeting Israel, crossing the blue line, and of course, it's that too. But Hezbollah is also a global terrorist group, and increasingly over the years it has developed into an international organized criminal syndicate. And if you really want to understand what Hezbollah is all about, you have to understand that too, and that was missing from the literature. In fact, Hezbollah has multiple identities. It's a political party, it's social welfare, militia, it's all of that, but it's other things. It's Lebanese, it's pan-Shia, it's pro-Iranian, it's committed all at once to the decrees of Iranian clerics, to the Lebanese state, its sectarian Shia community, to fellow Shia abroad, and all these different things can sometimes pull so that you find that Hezbollah is sometimes operating along multiple identities, multiple strands that sometimes are mutually exclusive. Consider, for example, as I'm sure we will during the Q&A, how and why it might be that Hezbollah, which was already under so much pressure in Lebanon, which was already under pressure because two of its senior people and two other not-so-senior people were indicted for the assassination of Rafi Hariri by the Special Tribunal for Lebanon in The Hague, how Hezbollah could decide in its calculus that it would be a wise move to side with Iran on behalf of the Assad regime, which was butchering its own people. A group that described itself as a resistance against Israeli occupation, suddenly fighting not south, but east, not Israelis, but Syrians, not Jews, but fellow Muslims. This actually has real implications not only for the public discourse, but also for the discourse I find within government circles. Back when I was still at the tail end of finishing my book on Hamas, I was invited to a US government conference, unclassified, but for current and former government analysts only here in Washington on Lebanon and Hezbollah. It was co-sponsored by two different parts of the US government, and each panel was chaired by someone from the US government. And on almost every panel, there was at least someone, usually someone brought in from Lebanon, but at least someone who said something like, look, I know you Americans and Israelis say Hezbollah's done all these terrible terrorist attacks abroad, but we all know it's not true. We all know it's only Al-Qaeda, so come on already. And I wasn't so surprised that someone might say that, but I was surprised that the US government moderators didn't say boo, didn't challenge the statement, didn't say, well, that's your perspective, but here's another. My favorite was when one person from Lebanon said, look, I know you Americans and Israelis believe that there's some guy out there named Imad Mughniya, who's supposedly the arch-terrorist for Hezbollah, but I, said this academic from Lebanon, I went and I got an audience with Hassan Nasrallah himself, with the Secretary General of the Party of God himself, and I asked him, does Mughniya exist? And he assures me that Mughniya does not. I'm not a very nice person, so in February 2008, when Munir was assassinated, I penned an email to this person, which was very succinct. It just said, and now we're both right. He did exist, and now he doesn't. But I didn't send it. But now that we're on C-SPAN, that person knows that I wrote it. And so after this conference, I started talking to people, not just Lebanese or Israelis or Americans, Canadians or Brits, but Chileans and Romanians and Singaporeans and Filipinos and Kuwaitis, and over the course of 9 years, conducted the research that eventually became this book. If we're going to start at the beginning, we're starting 30 years ago next month, with the bombings in Beirut, the bombings of the U.S. Marine barracks. In fact, it was over an 18-month period that Hezbollah carried out a series of attacks targeting Western interests, first in Lebanon, and then later Western interests in the region, in the Middle East, in particular in Kuwait, and then later in the West, first in Europe, and then eventually in the Western Hemisphere, in South America, in particular the 1992 and 1994 bombings of the Israeli embassy and the Ami Jewish Community Center in Buenos Aires, respectively. When it comes to the Beirut bombings, much of what was relevant then is relevant now. We now understand that both Imad Munir and his brother-in-law, Mustafa Badruddin, who has succeeded him as the head of Hezbollah's Islamic Jihad organization, its international strike wing, not only planned the Marine barracks bombings themselves, but watched the bombing unfold from a nearby rooftop, and then as the pressure built up in Lebanon, fled to Iran. It was there, according to New Zealand officials that I spoke to, that the IRGC helped them formalize and found the Islamic Jihad organization, the covert operations wing of Hezbollah, which itself was formed by Iranian agents as an umbrella group under which a variety of militant Lebanese extremist Shia groups were coalescing at the time in the early 1980s. We now know, only in retrospect, that the United States had intercepted a communication on September 26, 1983, weeks before the bombing, from Iran's Ministry of Intelligence and Security in Tehran to the Iranian ambassador in Damascus, telling the ambassador to contact a senior Shia militant tied to Hezbollah, later one of the leaders of Hezbollah, and to direct him to, quote, take spectacular action against the U.S. Marines, end quote. In the words of the commander of the Marines unit in Beirut at the time, and I quote, if there was ever a 24-karat gold document, this was it. U.S. intelligence caught Iranian officials instructing a Hezbollah leader to carry out an attack targeting the U.S. Marines in Lebanon, but the information didn't make its way through the bureaucracy until October 25th, 2 days after the bombing. Fast forward to today, by the way, we were just talking about all the news that's been happening over the long weekend. Der Spiegel is reporting that German intelligence has intercepted a call between a senior Hezbollah official and an Iranian official talking about how Assad was in fact behind last month's chemical weapons attack. By the spring of 1985, the CIA penned a Finnish intelligence report about terrorism in Lebanon entitled, and Rob would never let me get away with a title like this, Wild, Wild West Beirut. And while the State Department was writing about what it described as spillover of the Middle Eastern terrorist activities into Europe by Hezbollah and other terrorist groups, you had kidnappings, you had hijackings, you had activities throughout the region, 7 bombings in Kuwait in 1983, which led to the arrest of Badruddin, which then in turn led to the a long series of Hezbollah attacks around the world to secure the release of Mustafa Badruddin. The May 1985 attempted assassination of the Kuwaiti emir in Kuwait. Again, fast forward, many of the same groups, Hezbollah's Islamic Jihad organization, Iraq's Badr organization, even some of the exact same people would team up again 25 years later at Iran's behest to target coalition forces in Iraq. Things really began to pick up pace in Europe with the hijacking of TW-847 and the tragic assassination of Robert Stethem. Muhammad Ali Hamadi, who was one of the key hijackers and was wanted for the TWA-847 hijacking, was later arrested in 1987 at a Frankfurt airport, ferrying explosives to Hezbollah operatives elsewhere in Europe, in particular to Paris. You may recall the series of bombings that practically brought Paris to a standstill in 1985 and 1986. His compatriot, Hassan Izzaldin, was later linked to the 1988 hijacking of the Kuwait Air Flight 422 from Bangkok as part of Hezbollah's activities targeting Gulf states at the time. And then you had other operations in Europe One, for example, involved Bassam Maki in 1989. German intelligence intercepted his communications to his Hezbollah handlers back home, but couldn't quite figure out what he was talking about. Lots of references to buying BMWs, buying Mercedes, different types of Mercedes, different